The gavel hit the podium. The chatter of 50 garden club members died instantly. In the sudden silence, the smell of industrial floor wax seemed to choke me. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, a burning map of humiliation as every pair of eyes shifted to my corner. Mia stood at the front, impeccable. "Plot 4B, she announced, her voice cool and detached. "A chaotic eyesore. It violates bylaws 3 and 7. She finally looked up, pinning me to my chair. "You have 1 month to align with aesthetic standards under my supervision. Or your membership is revoked." The meeting adjourned, leaving me trapped in the orbit of the most rigid woman I had ever met. 3 days later, I was waiting in the humidity of my garden plot, surrounded by the low buzz of bees and the scent of damp, sun-warmed earth. It was early, the sun just starting to burn off the morning mist, but the air was already heavy. Sticking my shirt to my back, I was knee-deep in cosmos and bachelor's buttons, my hands coated in rich, dark soil, trying to make sense of the chaos Mia had condemned. Then the atmosphere shifted. You know that feeling when the barometric pressure drops right before a storm breaks? It was like that. Mia arrived with a military precision that felt almost aggressive in the soft morning light. She was walking down the gravel path, and the visual clash was immediate. In a community garden full of mud, mulch, and sweat, she was wearing a cream linen suit that looked like it had never seen a speck of dust. She stopped at the edge of my plot, checking her watch. 8:01 a.m. sharp, she said. No hello, no small talk, just the clipboard and the scrutiny. I stood up, wiping my hands on my jeans, acutely conscious of the dirt under my fingernails and the wild state of my hair. "Morning, Mia." She didn't smile. Her gaze swept over the garden, not seeing the life, but seeing the lack of lines. "It's unstructured," she noted, tapping her pen against the paper. A rhythmic, impatient sound. "The bylaws state clear demarcations between varieties. This is an entanglement." "It's a pollinator patch," I defended, though my voice lacked the bite I wanted. "Nature doesn't grow in grid lines, Mia. It grows where it needs to." She stepped closer. The distance between us collapsed, and suddenly the smell of damp earth was replaced by something else. Expensive soap and cold lilies. It was a sharp, clean scent that cut right through the humidity. She pointed to a sprawling vine of morning glories that had woven itself through a tomato cage. "That," she said, her voice dropping an octave, "is choking the infrastructure." She reached out. I thought she was going to rip the vine out, but instead, she reached for the bamboo stake I had loosely tied. Her hand brushed mine. It was just a graze, a fraction of a second where her manicured fingers slid against my calloused knuckles. But the contact was electric. It wasn't a spark, it was a thud, a heavy realization of proximity. Her skin was cool, dry, and impossibly soft. She froze. I froze. The bees kept buzzing, oblivious. But the silence between us stretched, taut, and vibrating. The tension coiled tight. She didn't pull away immediately. Her eyes, usually so guarded behind that professional veneer, flickered up to mine. For a second, she wasn't looking at the weeds. She was looking at the flush on my neck, the stray hair sticking to my temple. Her pupils dilated just a fraction. "It needs to be tighter," she said, her voice slightly breathless, though she hadn't moved. "The knot. It needs to be secure." "Right," I managed my own breath hitching. "Secure." She pulled her hand back, and the loss of contact felt like a physical drop in temperature. She cleared her throat, stepping back into her role as the commander, the head of the club, the woman who hated mess. But I saw it. Her hands were shaking. Just a little. "I've written down the required spacing measurements," she said, tearing a sheet off her clipboard and holding it out. I took it, careful not to touch her again. The paper was crisp, the handwriting severe and slanted. I'll be back next Tuesday to check your progress. Do not disappoint me, Sky. She turned on her heel, the cream suit pivoting sharply, and walked away. I watched her go, the lines of her posture rigid, her heels clicking on the paving stones. I looked down at the paper in my hand, then at the vine she had touched. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't fear. It was the terrifying magnetic pull of realizing that the woman trying to evict me was the only thing in the garden I wanted to look at. The air remained charged with her presence long after she was gone, leaving me unsettled and wanting more. I sat in my study, the silence of the house pressing against my ears, sterile, expensive, and curated. It smelled of lemon oil and old paper. On the mahogany desk in front of me, the inspection notes for Plot 4B lay open. The paper was smooth under my fingertips, but the words I'd written felt jagged. Violates aesthetic coherence. Invasive species present. Structural instability. I picked up my pen to finalize the eviction notice draft, but my hand hovered over the page. I wasn't seeing the stark white paper. I was seeing the smudge of dark, rich soil on Sky's cheekbone. It was infuriating. I closed my eyes, trying to recalibrate, to summon the cool, detached logic that had built my career and my reputation. But the memory was stubborn. It wasn't just the visual mess of her garden that lingered, it was the heat. Standing next to her had felt like standing next to an open furnace. There was a vibrancy there, a reckless, unpruned life force that made my own carefully manicured existence feel suddenly, painfully gray. I pushed the chair back, the scrape of wood on hardwood echoing too loudly in the empty room. I couldn't sit still. The energy in my chest was a tight, coiling spring that needed release. I needed to work. I needed to impose order on something. I went out to the greenhouse. This was my sanctuary, a glass cathedral dedicated to the art of the perfect bloom. The air inside was thick and humid, scented with the cloying sweetness of the grand flora roses I was cultivating for the gala. They were magnificent, pale pink, tight-budded, growing in perfectly straight lines. Obedient, I grabbed the shears. The weight of the steel in my hand was usually grounding, a reminder of my power to shape nature. I moved to the first bush, my eyes scanning for imperfections. A leaf with a brown spot. Snip. A stem growing at a 45-degree angle instead of 90. Snip. The rhythm should have been soothing. Assess. Correct. Perfect. But today, the rhythm was broken. Every time the blades clicked shut, I felt the ghost of Sky's pulse under my fingers. I had touched her hand for less than 2 seconds, yet my skin still felt the phantom pressure of her warmth. It was a data point that refused to integrate. Why did her chaos feel so much more alive than my perfection? I reached for a spent bloom, my grip on the shears tightening until my knuckles turned white. I wasn't pruning anymore. I was attacking. I slashed at a thorny branch that had dared to drift toward the walkway. The metal bit through the wood with a violent crack. A perfect half-open bud fell to the concrete floor, severed by my carelessness. I stared down at it. The pink petals were bruised where they hit the ground. I had destroyed it because I wasn't paying attention. I was too busy fighting the realization that was clawing its way up my throat. I didn't hate Sky's wildflowers. I hated that she was allowed to be wild. I hated that she stood in the dirt, messy and unpolished and radiant, while I was trapped in a suit of armor I had welded shut myself. The envy was a bitter taste in my mouth. It wasn't about the bylaws. It was about the freedom I had denied myself for 20 years. I dropped the shears on the bench, The clang shattered the quiet. I couldn't stay here. The perfection of the roses felt suffocating, a mocking reminder of everything I was repressing. I needed to see it again. I needed to see her again. To prove to myself that she was just a nuisance, just a rule breaker, just a mess to be cleaned up. I told myself it was a spot check. I told myself I was going to catch her violating another code to build my case for the board. It was a lie, and I knew it. I grabbed my keys, the metal biting into my palm. My movements were sharp, driven by a gravity I couldn't name. Although I walked to the car, the gravel crunching under my heels like breaking bones. I didn't look back at the house, at the perfect empty windows. I drove toward the community gardens, toward the mud and the chaos, terrified by the speed at which I was willing to crash. The sky didn't just darken, it bruised. 1 minute, I was knee-deep in the sprawling chaos of my wildflower patch, tying back a rogue stem of goldenrod. The next, the sunlight vanished, swallowed whole by a wall of slate-gray clouds rolling in from the west. The wind picked up instantly, whipping the cosmos into a frenzy of pink and white motion, and I knew, bone deep, that we were about to get hammered. I stood up, wiping a streak of sweat from my forehead, and that's when I saw her, Mia. She had just stepped out of her pristine silver sedan in the gravel lot, clutching that damn clipboard like a shield. She looked up at the sky, annoyance flashing across her sharp features. She was probably calculating the probability of rain against her meticulously planned schedule. But nature didn't care about her spreadsheets. The bottom dropped out of the world. It wasn't a drizzle. It was a deluge. A curtain of water slammed into the earth with violent force. "Run!" I yelled, though the wind tore the word away. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her heels sinking into the wet gravel, before instinct finally overrode protocol. We both bolted for the only shelter in sight, the communal tool shed at the back of the lot. It was a rotting cedar shack, barely big enough for a lawnmower, let alone 2 people, but we didn't have a choice. I yanked the warped wooden door open, and she stumbled in past me, a blur of wet cream linen. I followed, slamming the door shut against the gale, sealing us in. The silence inside was instant and shocking, punctuated only by the deafening rhythmic drumroll of rain, hammering on the corrugated tin roof. It was pitch black for a long heartbeat, until my eyes adjusted to the gloom. The air here was thick, trapped, smelling intensely of old gasoline, dry cedar chips, and the metallic tang of rusting shears. But underneath that, as the space shrank around us, I smelled her again. The lilies, now mixed with the sharp electric scent of ozone and wet earth. We were standing inches apart. There was nowhere else to go. A shelf full of terracotta pots dug into my back, and Mia was pressed up against the handle of a shovel. The storm had stripped away her armor in seconds. Her suit was soaked dark at the shoulders, clinging to her frame. Her hair, the architectural marvel I had stared at for days, was plastered to her skull, water dripping from the ends onto her collar. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling in a rapid, shallow rhythm that matched my own. She looked furious, not at me, but at the universe for daring to reign without her permission. 0%, she hissed, wiping water from her eyes with a trembling hand. The forecast said 0% precipitation. The wind shifted, I said, my voice sounding too loud and too rough in the cramped space. You could smell the pressure drop an hour ago. I don't smell pressure, Sky. I read data. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself as the damp cold settled in. It's messy. It ruins the schedule. It ruins the soil composition. It feeds the roots, I countered softly, watching her shiver. You can't control the weather, Mia. You just have to let it soak in. Things grow better when they aren't forced. She looked up at me then, and the argument died in her throat. The shed was dim, lit only by the gray, watery light filtering through the cracks in the wood planks. But I saw her eyes darken. The anger drained away, replaced by something heavier, something that pulled at the center of my chest. I watched a single droplet of rainwater detach itself from a wet strand of her hair. It slid slow and heavy down the side of her face, tracing the sharp line of her jaw, hesitating at the hollow of her throat before disappearing under the damp collar of her shirt. My eyes tracked the movement, helpless to look away, imagining the cool path it took against her skin. The air between us grew hot, pressurized by the storm outside and the body heat radiating inside. I could see the goosebumps rising on her wet arms. I wanted, with a sudden, violent urge, to reach out and brush the water away, to warm her up, to bridge the tiny gap that remained. She didn't move. She didn't check her watch. She just watched me watching her. Her lips parted slightly, a quick intake of breath that I felt against my own chin. The sound of the rain began to fade, tapering off into a rhythmic dripping, but neither of us moved toward the door. The storm had trapped us, but the silence was keeping us there. I walked back toward Plot 4B with a potted rosa peace cradled in my arms, a peace offering, literally and figuratively. I needed to prove to myself that Sky was just a gardener, just a woman, and not a seismic event threatening to level my life. I found her wrestling with a sprawling, vicious blackberry cane that had encroached from the fence line. She was wearing thick canvas gloves, but she was moving with frantic, frustrated energy, hacking at the stem rather than negotiating with it. She looked up as I approached, her hair pulled back in a messy knot, sweat glistening on her collarbone. She stopped mid-swing, the shears hovering in the air. "You're fighting it," I said, setting the pot down on the edge of the raised bed. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. "You can't bully a cane like that. It will just splinter and infect the root." Sky wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of loam across her temple. "It's stubborn, Mia. It keeps coming back. Because you're cutting it at the anxiety point, not the growth point." I stepped closer. The gravitational pull was immediate, a physical tug in my solar plexus. I took a breath, inhaling the scent of crushed green stems and the warm, musky smell of her skin. "May I?" She exhaled slowly, then nodded, stepping back slightly but not enough to clear my personal space. She held out the shears. I didn't take them. Instead, I stepped in behind her, close enough that the fabric of my blazer brushed against her flannel shirt. "Keep them," I murmured. "I'll show you the angle." I reached out and covered her hands with mine. The heat radiating from her was immediate, seeping through the thick canvas of her gloves to my cool skin. Her hands were solid, broad, and strong beneath my fingers. My own hands, usually so steady, felt small and pale against the rough landscape of hers. I forced myself to focus on the plant, to use the structure of the lesson as a shield against the sudden vertigo. "Relax your grip," I instructed. My voice had dropped, losing its command deck sharpness. "You're strangling the tool. Let the blade do the work." I guided her hands, adjusting the angle of the shears to a 45-degree slope against the cane. I could feel the tension in her forearms, the rigid lines of her muscles beneath the flannel. I pressed my thumbs into the back of her wrists, a silent command to yield. Slowly, perceptibly, she softened. Her shoulders dropped. She leaned back, just a fraction of an inch, until her warmth was a solid wall against my front. "Here," I whispered, guiding the blades to the node. "The thorn protects the bud. You don't crush it, you navigate around it." We squeezed the handles together, the metal sliced cleanly through the wood with a satisfying snick, far different from the hacking sound she had been making before. The cane fell away. "See," I said, but I didn't let go. I should have stepped back. The lesson was over, the correction was made, but I was paralyzed by the sensory overload. I was staring at the side of her neck, where a single, dark curl had escaped her hair tie. Beneath the tanned skin, I could see the rapid, frantic flutter of her pulse. It was beating against her skin like a trapped bird. She wasn't immune. She wasn't indifferent. She was affected. For years, I believed that stability came from rigidity. I thought that if I held myself perfectly still, if I pruned away every erratic impulse, I would be safe. But standing there, wrapped in the chaotic warmth of a woman who grew weeds on purpose, I felt steadier than I had in decades. Her roughness didn't grate on me, it anchored me. It was the trellis I hadn't realized I needed. My thumb brushed the exposed skin of her wrist just above the glove line. It was an involuntary movement, a betrayal of my own rules. She drew in a sharp, shaky breath, and the sound vibrated through my own chest. "Mia," she breathed. It wasn't a question. It was a warning, or maybe an invitation. I pulled my hands away as if I had been burned. The loss of contact was physically painful, a sudden cold snap in the middle of July. I stepped back, smoothing my blazer, trying to reassemble the shattered fragments of my composure. "That's the technique," I said, my voice tight. "Apply it to the rest of the bed." I turned to leave, my heart hammering a frantic, dangerous rhythm against my ribs. I had come here to teach her how to handle thorns, but as I walked away, I realized I was the one who had been cut open. The light changed first. The harsh, exposing glare of the afternoon sun finally surrendered, dissolving into a wash of bruised violet and heavy, molten gold that stretched long, distorted shadows across the garden beds. It was that specific time of evening when the world seems to hold its breath, suspended between the demands of the day and the secrets of the night. I was weeding the perimeter of the new mixed bed, my knees sinking into the cooling soil, but my attention wasn't on the roots. It was on the bench a few feet away. Mia was there. But it wasn't the Mia who ran meetings with a gavel and a glare. For the first time since I'd met her, the armor was gone. Her cream blazer, the symbol of her unyielding authority, was discarded in a heap on the wooden slats. She had rolled the sleeves of her silk blouse up to her elbows, revealing pale forearms that looked deceptively delicate. She was repotting a tray of seedlings, her movements slow, lacking that military precision I had come to expect. She looked human. She looked exhausted. She reached for a trowel, but her hand slipped on the slick plastic of the tray. The tool clattered to the ground, bouncing off her shoe. I braced myself for the sharp intake of breath, the curse, the immediate self-correction. But instead, she just stared at the trowel. Then she laughed. It wasn't a polite social laugh. It was a genuine throaty sound that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep and rusty. It transformed her face instantly. The sharp angles of her cheekbones softened, her eyes crinkled at the corners, and for a second, she looked 10 years younger. "I'm losing my grip," she said, the laughter fading into a sigh that sounded like a heavy weight hitting the floor. She leaned back, wiping her hands on a rag, not caring that she smeared a streak of potting soil across her pristine cuff. I stood up and walked over, the gravel crunching softly under my boots. "You've been here since 6 this morning, Mia? Even the sun clocks out eventually." She looked up at me, shielding her eyes against the dying light. "If I clock out, things stop growing. If I stop watching, the weeds take over. That's the rule, Sky. Vigilance." That's not a rule, I said, sitting down on the other end of the bench. The distance between us was small, bridged by the heavy, sweet scent of the nicotiana flowers beginning to open for the night. That's a cage. She went quiet, looking down at her hands. They were trembling slightly, the fine tremors of pure fatigue. It's expected, she murmured, her voice losing its projection, dropping to a register that felt dangerously intimate. Everyone expects the gala to be flawless. The board expects the budget to balance. My mother expected, well, everything. She let out a breath that shook. I'm so tired of being the only thing standing between order and disaster. I'm terrified that if I let go for 1 second, I'll just dissolve. The vulnerability in her voice was a physical blow. It stripped away my defensiveness, leaving only a glowing, warm empathy. I realized then that her rigidity wasn't arrogance, it was fear. She wasn't trying to control me. She was trying to keep herself from falling apart. I reached out. I didn't think about it. I just laid my hand on her forearm, right where the sleeve was rolled up. Her skin was warm, damp with the humidity of the evening. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. Her breath hitched, a sharp intake of air, and her eyes locked onto mine, wide and startled. I could feel the tension in her muscle, tight as a bowstring, and I kept my hand steady, a grounding weight against the vibration of her anxiety. You aren't a retaining wall, Mia, I said softly. You're just a woman in a garden. You're allowed to be tired. You're allowed to be messy. The world isn't going to end if you sit still for 5 minutes. She looked at my hand on her arm, then back up to my face. The guarded look melted away, replaced by a raw, hungry openness. I don't know how to stop, she whispered. I've never known how to just be. Then let me be still for you, I answered. We sat there as the gold faded to indigo. I didn't move my hand. She didn't ask me to. The tension that usually snapped between us like a live wire softened, spreading out into a warm, comfortable silence. The crickets started their nightly chorus, and the air cooled, but the heat between our skin remained, a steady, anchoring point in the gathering dark. For the first time, we weren't opponents. We were just two women, hidden by the shadows, sharing the weight of the night. The community center ballroom smelled of panic and floral preservative. It was 48 hours until the annual Garden Club Gala, and the air was thick with the static electricity of a dozen volunteers rushing to meet an impossible deadline. This was my arena. I was moving through the chaos with a clipboard in one hand and a radio in the other, directing the placement of tables with the precision of an air traffic controller. My voice was hoarse, my feet ached in my heels, and my patience had evaporated 3 hours ago. But then I looked at table 4. Sky wasn't supposed to be here. The gala prep committee was a closed circle of senior members, a group of women who treated flower arranging like competitive surgery. Sky didn't have the clearance, and she certainly didn't have the invitation. Yet there she was, standing at a workstation covered in buckets of my prize-winning grand flora roses and armfuls of the wildflowers she had harvested from her own plot that morning. I stopped in the middle of the floor, letting the chaos swirl around me. I should have told her to leave. I should have cited the protocol regarding unauthorized volunteers. Instead, I just watched. She was working with a focus that was terrifyingly attractive. Her sleeves were rolled up past her elbows, exposing the tanned, strong lines of her forearms as she worked the stems. She wasn't fighting the flowers. That was the difference. The other women were wrestling their blooms into submission, forcing them into rigid, spherical prisons of green foam. Sky was having a conversation with them. I watched her hands. They were dusted with pollen, moving with a fluid, confident dexterity that made my breath catch in my throat. She took one of my perfect pale pink roses, a flower I had spent months cultivating to be flawless, and nestled it against a spray of wild purple aster and chaotic fern. It shouldn't have worked. The rigid structure of the rose should have clashed with the messy, unkempt energy of the wildflowers, but it didn't clash. It sang. The wildness of the ferns made the rose look softer, more alive. The structure of the rose gave the wildflowers a purpose. It was a merger of two completely different languages into a single, coherent sentence. Mia. The voice was sharp, cutting through my trance. I turned to find Mrs. Higgins, the club treasurer, standing beside me. She was staring at Sky's table with a look of undisguised horror. Her mouth pursed into a tight line of disapproval. "Is there a reason?" Mrs. Higgins asked, her voice carrying that distinct tone of polite malice. "That we are polluting the centerpieces with weeds? The theme is classic elegance, not roadside ditch." The insult hung in the air, heavy and ugly. Normally, I would have agreed. Normally, I would have apologized, removed the offending arrangements, and restored order. That was the protocol. That was the safe play. But the heat that flared in my chest wasn't diplomatic. It was volcanic. "They aren't weeds, Martha," I said. My voice was low, but it had a serrated edge that made Mrs. Higgins take a half step back. "They are native structural elements. And they are staying." Mrs. Higgins blinked, clearly stunned. "But the aesthetic guidelines? The guidelines are there to ensure quality, not to strangle creativity." I cut her off, my gaze hard. "The arrangement is balanced. It has texture. It has life. If you can't see the difference between a weed and a deliberate design choice, then perhaps you shouldn't be on the judging committee this year." The silence that followed was absolute. I had never spoken to a board member like that. I had never risked my standing for anyone, let alone for a woman who broke every rule I held sacred. Mrs. Higgins flushed a deep, mottled red, turned on her heel, and marched away without another word. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, heavy rhythm. I looked back at table 4. Sky had stopped working. She was looking at me across the bustling room, her hands still resting on the arrangement. She had heard every word. The look she gave me wasn't gratitude, it was something far more dangerous. Her eyes were dark, intense, stripping away the distance between us. In that crowded, noisy room, the rest of the world just fell away. It was just me and her, connected by an invisible, high-tension wire. I realized then, with a jolt of terrifying clarity, that I hadn't defended the flowers. I had defended her. The admiration I felt for her work was bleeding into a desire that I could no longer categorize as professional. I wanted the chaos she brought. I wanted the way she looked at me, like I was something wild that needed to be uncovered, not something broken that needed to be fixed. She didn't smile. She just nodded, a slow, deliberate acknowledgement of the line I had just crossed, and turned back to her work. But her hands were moving slower now, and I could see the flush rising on the back of her neck. The air in the ballroom was suddenly too hot, charged with a simmering anticipation that had nothing to do with the gala and everything to do with the woman weaving weeds into my roses. The ballroom didn't smell like a garden. It smelled like money. The air was a suffocating, curated blend of expensive perfume, hairspray, and the cloying, sweet scent of lilies that had been forced open under hot lights. It was a sensory assault that felt entirely artificial. Soft jazz drifted from the corner stage, a polite, unobtrusive rhythm that competed with the sharp, crystalline clinking of champagne flutes and the low, murmuring hum of 100 restrained conversations. I stood near the back of the room, Adjusting the strap of the only formal dress I owned, a simple charcoal slip that felt dangerously thin compared to the heavy flannel and denim I lived in, I felt like a transplant, a rough-edged wildflower shoved into a crystal vase, hoping nobody noticed the dirt that I could never quite scrub from under my fingernails. I kept my hands clasped behind my back, watching the room swirl. It was a kaleidoscope of pastel chiffon and dark suits, a world of rigid social geometry where everyone stayed in their assigned rows. Then the crowd parted, and the geometry shattered. Mia was standing near the center of the room, holding court with the board of directors. The air seemed to vacuum out of my lungs. She was breathtaking, but in a way that felt sharp, almost weaponized. She was wearing a gown of deep midnight blue silk that looked like it had been engineered rather than sewn. It was structured, architectural, holding its shape like steel, with a neckline that plunged just enough to be dangerous. Her hair was swept up in a severe, intricate twist, exposing the long, elegant line of her neck. She looked terrifying. She looked perfect. To everyone else in that room, she was the formidable president, the woman who kept the bylaws sacred and the chaos at bay. But I didn't see the president. I saw the woman who had laughed in the dirt with potting soil on her cuff. I saw the tremor in her hand when she touched my arm in the greenhouse. The armor was back on, polished to a high, blinding shine, but I knew where the cracks were. I knew that beneath that midnight silk, her heart was beating a frantic, human rhythm just like mine. I couldn't breathe in there anymore. The perfection was too tight, too loud. I slipped out the side French doors onto the stone terrace, desperate for air that hadn't been filtered through 1,000 expectations. The night air hit me like a blessing, cool and smelling of damp grass, river water, and the distant earthy scent of the woods. I walked to the stone railing, gripping the cold masonry, trying to slow my heart rate. The darkness here felt like a permission slip, a place where the rules didn't apply. "You're hiding?" The voice came from behind me, low and unmistakable. I didn't turn around immediately. I let the sound of it settle over me, feeling the familiar, heavy pull in my chest. "I'm observing," I corrected, turning slowly. Mia was standing in the doorway, the warm golden light from the ballroom framing her silhouette. She stepped out into the shadows, and the door clicked shut behind her, muting the jazz and the laughter. The silence that fell between us wasn't empty. It was pressurized. It was heavy, loaded with everything we hadn't said for a month. She walked toward me, the silk of her dress rustling softly like dry leaves. She stopped close enough that I could smell her signature scent, that clean mix of rain and white flowers, rising over the garden smells. It made my head spin. "The centerpieces," she said softly, her voice stripping away the professional distance she had worn inside. "They're the talk of the evening. Mrs. Higgins is pretending she came up with the concept of structural whimsy. She told the mayor that the contrast represents the duality of modern horticulture." "They needed the structure," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, rougher than I intended. "And the roses needed the mess. They were dying of boredom, Mia." Mia didn't look at the garden below us. She was looking at me. Her gaze was slow, deliberate, mapping the line of my jaw, the curve of my neck, the way the dress hung on my frame. It wasn't a critique. It wasn't an inspection. It was a hunger. It was the way a person looks at water after crossing a desert. The cool, detached mask was gone, replaced by an expression so open, so raw, that it felt like a physical touch. "You look," she trailed off, searching for a word that fit the data, her eyes dark and unreadable in the gloom. She took a half step closer, invading my personal space, erasing the safety zone. "You look dangerous, Sky." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat that I was sure she could hear. The tension was a physical weight, a magnetic pull that made my knees weak. I held her gaze, refusing to blink, refusing to let her retreat behind the bylaws or the safety of the podium. Dangerous is a violation of the safety code, isn't it? I asked, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. I leaned in, just an inch, challenging the distance. The space between us was charged, electric, thick with the promise of a storm. Are you going to write me up, Mia? Are you going to cite the rulebook and tell me I'm out of order? I let my gaze drop to her lips, then back up to her eyes, daring her to run. Or are you finally going to say what you're thinking? I stared at her. The question hung in the damp night air, vibrating with a frequency that shattered my last line of defense. Are you going to write me up? The absurdity of it clawed at my throat. For decades, I had treated life like a blueprint. Straight lines, load-bearing walls, predictable outcomes. I had convinced myself that safety was the same thing as happiness. But looking at Sky, standing there in the shadows with her chin tilted up and her eyes burning with a defiance that mirrored my own repressed hunger, the blueprint dissolved. The logic that had ruled my life felt suddenly violently inadequate. I didn't want to document the violation. I wanted to be the violation. I took a step forward. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a surrender to gravity. The distance between us, which I had policed so rigorously for weeks, collapsed. I saw her eyes widen, a flicker of genuine surprise breaking through her bravado. She expected the gavel. She expected the rulebook. I'm done with the rules, I whispered. The words felt foreign, rough against my tongue, but they were the truest thing I had said in years. And I'm done thinking. I barely had time to process the shift before she was there. One moment, she was the statue on the pedestal. The next, she was moving into my space with a terrifying, fluid grace. Her hands came up, not to push me away, but to cup my face. The contact was anchoring. Her palms were cool, her fingers firm and possessive, thumbs tracing the line of my cheekbones with a deliberate, unhurried pressure. My breath hitched, trapping itself in my chest. This wasn't the tentative touch of a gardener afraid of thorns. This was a claim. Then she kissed me. It wasn't a movie kiss. It was desperate. It was the feeling of a dam breaking under too much pressure. Her lips were soft, tasting faintly of the dry champagne she'd been nursing, but the cadence was urgent. I made a low sound, a noise I couldn't suppress, and my hands found their way into her hair. I pulled the pins loose, needing to feel the silk of it, needing to destroy the perfect architecture she had spent hours creating. The sensation was overwhelming. Sky wasn't passive. She met me with a force that matched my own. Her hands in my hair were grounding, anchoring me to the earth in a way no spreadsheet ever could. The scent of her, warm skin, potting soil, and the night air flooded my senses. The structured, perfect world of the gala dissolved. The jazz faded. The heavy scent of lilies vanished. There was only the rough stone of the railing against my back and the overwhelming grounding heat of her body pressed against mine. I realized, with a jolt of pure clarity, that I wasn't falling. I was finally landing. We broke apart, gasping, our foreheads pressing together as we fought to reclaim the oxygen we had shared. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her chest. I kept my eyes closed, my hands sliding down to grip her shoulders, afraid that if I let go, I would float away. The wildflowers, I murmured against her lips, my voice trembling with the aftershocks of the crash. They were never a mess, Sky. I was blind. I didn't know how to look at something I couldn't control. I opened my eyes. Mia looked wrecked. Her lipstick was smudged, her hair was cascading over one shoulder in a beautiful, chaotic wave, and the mask was gone. The woman looking back at me wasn't the president. She was just Mia, and she was terrified. I ran my thumbs over the tense line of her jaw, smoothing away the fear. The sounds of the gala, the jazz, the laughter, the clinking glass felt a million miles away. We had created our own world out here in the dark, a world with no bylaws and no fences. "You aren't blind," I whispered, leaning in to brush my lips against her temple. "You just needed to get your hands dirty." The morning after the gala didn't feel like a hangover. It felt like the first deep breath I'd taken in 20 years. The sun was already high when I pulled up to the community plots, but for the first time, I wasn't checking my watch. I wasn't calculating efficiency or drafting mental apologies for the board. I was just arriving. I walked down the gravel path, the sound softer today, maybe because I was wearing sneakers instead of heels. Sky was already there, of course. She was kneeling in the dirt, back to me, working on the perimeter of the new bed. She didn't jump when I stepped onto the plot. She just turned, shielding her eyes from the sun, and gave me a smile that felt like coming home. No armor, no gavel, just us. "You're late," she teased, but her voice was warm, lacking any real bite. I slept in, I admitted, sitting down on the bench, not perching, but actually sitting. And I brought coffee. "Black for me, obscene sugar for you." She took the cup, our fingers brushing against the cardboard. The electricity was still there, that hum of attraction, but the frantic, terrifying edge was gone. It had settled into something steadier, a low-grade warmth that radiated through my chest. We didn't talk about the gala. We didn't need to dissect the kiss or draft a memorandum of understanding. The air between us was clear. We spent the morning breaking ground on the new experimental bed. This was the compromise, or rather, the collaboration. I brought the structure, a geometric layout of English shrub roses spaced perfectly for airflow. Sky brought the life, a riotous underplanting of creeping thyme, wild geraniums, and self-seeding poppies that would fill every gap with unpredictable color. As we worked, I watched her hands. They were still rough, still stained, but I noticed the care in them. Now, she wasn't just throwing seeds, she was tucking them in, and she was watching me, too. "You missed a spot," she murmured, pointing to a clod of clay I hadn't broken up. "It adds texture," I countered, throwing her own words back at her. She laughed, the sound vibrating in the quiet morning air. "Careful, Mia. You start liking texture, and next thing you know, you'll be letting dandelions stay." "Let's not get carried away," I smiled, digging my trowel into the earth. But the truth was, I didn't mind the dirt on my hands anymore. I looked down at my knees, stained with mud, and felt a strange sense of pride. The fear of being messy, of being imperfect, had dissolved in the rain and the moonlight. I realized that the structure I loved wasn't about keeping things out. It was about creating a space safe enough for things to grow wild. Sky stopped digging and leaned back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead. "You know," she said, her voice turning thoughtful, "I used to think your roses were stuck up. Too stiff. But watching you, they need that stiffness to hold the weight of the blooms. Without the cane, the flower ends up in the mud." "And without the wildflowers," I replied softly, "the roses look lonely. They look like they're in a museum, not a garden." I reached out. There was a smudge of dark soil high on her cheekbone, stark against her flushed skin. Instinctively, I wanted to clean it, to fix the imperfection. But as my thumb brushed against her softness, I didn't wipe it away. I just traced the line of it, letting my hand linger, cupping her jaw. She leaned into my touch, her eyes fluttering shut. The birds were singing, a tractor was humming in the distance, but in that square of earth, the silence was profound. It was the silence of two things finally fitting together. We were just growing, side by side, roots tangling in the dark where no one could see, anchoring each other against the next storm. The garden looks different now. It's not the neat, segregated grid it used to be. It's a riot of color, a collision of structured elegance and wild, vibrant chaos. It breaks about a dozen bylaws, but nobody complains anymore because it's the most beautiful thing in the county. Mia learned that you can't control everything, and I learned that a little support lets you reach higher than you ever could alone. Her rules have bent, and my chaos has found a safe harbor. We sit on that bench every evening now, watching the sunset over our shared work. If you enjoyed watching this tension bloom into something beautiful, subscribe for more stories of unexpected love. Sometimes the most beautiful things grow where you least expect them.